and welcome back to this episode of Inside Legal ESG. We are so fortunate to have with us today Sandy Hansen-Wolff, a professionally certified executive coach focusing on transitions and turnarounds. She's also a serial entrepreneur, and she coaches executives in a wide range of industries. Welcome, Sandy. We're really excited to talk to you today.
Happy to be here, Pam. Thank you.
So let's start out. Can you tell me a little bit about your consulting practice and how you got into this work?
Yes, I would love to. So I do, like you said, a wide range of consulting and private executive and leadership coaching. And I would say the main theme behind all I do is really igniting people again and igniting a business and a culture again. There's so many of us that have felt lost and overwhelmed and exhausted. And I've really worked for 15 years actually in this consulting and coaching and speaking role of really how do we elevate the entire paradigm? How do we bring new paradigm leadership and thought into companies? And how I got started was really by my own business path 20 years ago when my first husband passed away unexpectedly. And I was thrust into his business that he owned. And I had another professional path I was going down. And so I became responsible for his company and decided to lead it and grow it and transform it. And so just by happenstance, I guess, or situation, people watched how I and my team transformed and turned around our company in the midst of a disaster and crisis point when he passed away. And finally scaled to an exit of 2.5 years ago. Wow. And so people would come to me and say, well, now we need help with our company. Will you help me? And my goal always is to have other people's path be easier than mine was.
That's an admirable goal, and we all appreciate it, those of us who have had the privilege of working with you. So tell me your typical client or your ideal client.
Yes, I would say it's kind of the same, typical and ideal. I always tell people I get to work with brilliant, successful leaders who have already done amazing things in their career paths. And they come to me when they're looking for kind of that next elevated solution and more of that new thought pattern. And how do we basically take quantum leaps to get out of like the looping patterns we've been in? How do we transform a culture? How do we ignite everything again and everyone? And so these are usually very, very accomplished and influential leaders. And sometimes it's teams that I work with, and I'm so grateful and humbled by the work I do every day, and elevating people to their own self-actualization and seeing successes happen more quickly and outside of that old thinking of, well, it has to be hard and it has to be slow. Those days are gone.
And so tell me about the industries you work in and the size company. Is there a typical size company?
Yes. Well, good question, Pam. I am just thrilled because I was once an entrepreneur of a smaller company. So my business really runs the gamut of some, not necessarily, once in a while I'll get a startup entrepreneur, but entrepreneurs who started and now are looking to scale and to scale in quick order because they either have to because of demand. And to scale successfully, there's a lot of scaling that happens that isn't so profitable. Right. So that's the one end. And then, so like those small to medium-sized companies. And then I also work with a lot of executives and corporate clients too. I facilitate peer groups and have done that for many years, like mastermind type groups, and get to speak on stages to very accomplished leaders and across the sectors. It's not one or the other. Mostly people hire me because I ran a company. And so I know kind of all of the facets that go on. And obviously there's much more to learn, but I have a good understanding of accounting and finance, of team management, of culture building, and so on.
Mhm. So this podcast is about ESG. So I'm really curious to hear, how are you seeing ESG pop up in your work?
Yes. Well, kind of like the mix of my clients, I would say that answer is also a mix and a wide range. I'm a believer in ESG. It's
Mhm.
obviously not a new idea, but it's one that's really taken off in the last few years. And so sometimes people have not heard of ESG. Or they're not making the connection of, oh, some of what we're doing are elements of ESG.
Yes, yes.
And so they're doing some of the segment work, on the one side of the spectrum without really knowing much about ESG. And that's just meeting people where they're at. To corporate clients who have ESG professionals within their company, or are that person themselves, which is really exciting. And they're leading the way on developing the platform and getting their cohorts and colleagues and other staff to join the forces and move with them.
It's so interesting you should say that. Some companies are already doing elements of it, but they just don't recognize that it's ESG. I find that true as well in my clients, because companies are doing a lot of things already, but often they're very disjointed or random or siloed. They're not cohesive and holistic.
Right.
And that's part of the reason they don't see it as part of ESG. And they also think that ESG is something different than what they do to run their business. And it's really not. It's just a framework of how you're running your business, not something to the side or added on or separate from. So getting that mindset in place, I think, is really important.
Yes. And I love the word mindset, because it really is. It's not an either or, it's a yes and at this point, as you know.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of mindset and sentiment, are you or have you experienced any anti-ESG sentiment? Obviously, there's plenty of it to go around, particularly here in the US, not so much outside of the US. And if so, how do you talk about it? How do you address those?
Yes.
Those sentiments?
Yes, great question. And I'd say for professionals like yourself, Pam, who are immersed in this space, this is one that likely makes us want to pull our hair out sometimes. However, the work that I do is always a practice of meeting people and companies where they're at. And what your view is might not be my view, and so on. And it's very interesting and fascinating, and then sometimes highly disappointing, of course, when some of them just are really, they have adverse attitudes toward it. Like, this is hocus pocus, and this is just the next thing, and we don't need to do this. It's it's corporate America who has plenty of money to do this. They're doing it, and not for us. I hear quite often, but usually it's not that. I would say that's a smaller and smaller population. Some of them know they should, and it's daunting and overwhelming.
It is.
And so I consider myself an ESG generalist because of my background, or what I do with clients, which is overall business strategy and executive coaching, and so we're having a lot of conversations now. And my goal is to help them realize what they're already doing, and that, like, this is an adage I'll borrow from one of my colleagues who's also a professional in this space. He said, you're either going to be a buffoon and not do it and have to catch up and perhaps be in legal trouble at some point, or deal with some regulations coming down on you as a company or a professional, or you'll be the hero. And you'll do it on your terms and develop the platform and make it work for your culture as we go. So I think that's interesting. So most have heard of some aspect of it, but there's obviously a lot of education to do yet.
Yes. And I think your colleagues' comments are spot on, because eventually this isn't going to be a choice. So it is a do it now or do it when your customers request it of you, and then you'll be playing catch up. And this goes back to something that you and I were just discussing before we started recording, is supply chain expectations of their vendors and suppliers. And, you know, all companies have customers or they wouldn't be in business. And if your customers are on a ESG journey, part of that journey requires that their supply chain vendors also make progress on ESG. Right. And there's all sorts of tools out there to help companies help their vendors and suppliers get started on ESG. And so in my world, some of this is what's prompting action, is client pressure. But you know, smart, proactive companies will get a jump start, because that way they can say, yes, we have what you need, and here it is, and here's what we're doing, rather than, what are you talking about? And then 6 months later, you know, be scrambling to get something produced.
Yes, and I really feel my role is to be that first gate opener to the conversation and really encourage them. And, you know, as a consultant and an executive coach and leadership advisor to teams, it would be a miss if I wouldn't bring this up as an important topic, to push, you know, like it's my job to push the envelope a little bit, you know, in a charismatic kind way. And I have used language like that, Pam, of your consumers are watching you. They are looking at your website and they're reading to see if you have sustainability practices, if you have like a, you know, like a diverse board, for example, and they are going to make and are making buying decisions accordingly. So you can ignore this, but your consumers are not, and that day is here.
Consumers, absolutely. And I would also say talent, right?
Yes, absolutely.
The younger generations that are looking for who it is they want to be employed by, these are things that they look for on the websites, and they want to see evidence of it in your culture and your behaviors.
Yes. And I always tell them too, it's like simple works. Let's start with building a simple platform, and I can help them with that. And then I do turn it over to the more seasoned professionals when we get into legal ramifications and so on, and deeper policy.
So what component of ESG do your clients gravitate to, or what seems most important to them? I mean, ESG covers a lot of ground, but in your world, what seems to be the prominent component of ESG that people are working on?
Yes, again, multifaceted, but if I had to pick a few, I would say it's anything that relates to them being successful as a leader. And I don't mean that in a way that's, you know, self-centered or whatever, but like, for example, leadership is looking at how do we create a culture of unity again, you know, and so that S component, the social component of ESG is very, very important. How do we create well-being in the workplace? How do we create a culture of retention and happiness? You know, and that all plays into some of the S category of ESG. You know, governance is a big one too, where, you know, we do need more diversity, and that's taken very seriously now. And whereas before, you know, like 5-10 years ago, it wasn't thought of with such careful attention. And that's across the segments too. So they're looking at thought leadership even in governance, and not necessarily just the diversity of people and ages and so on. So like that's been really fascinating to watch. And obviously the environmental sustainability, that's here also. So some of this at this point, Pam, is being governed by what they have to do first, and that's okay, because we always need a starting point. And again, I'll push the envelope and say, yes, let's tackle this, and since we're focused on this, why don't we put the full picture together, you know, in a simple manner.
And we talked a little bit earlier about what they have to do because of customer pressure or recruiting desirable talent. But, we haven't yet touched on regulations, and eventually regulations are going to require this. I find it interesting that while we are waiting for the SEC regs to be issued, presumably any day now, California is passed a bill that is going to require disclosure of certain size companies that do business in California, regardless of whether you're domiciled there or whether you have whether you're publicly listed. So even private companies, California is at least leading the way with respect to what is going to be expected of them going forward. So to our earlier point, this is a do it now or do it later. It's not do I do it or don't I do it. It's going to be required, just it's cost of doing business. Okay, so here's one of my favorite questions to ask my podcast guests. Given the complexities of society, and we've talked about a number of them, what gives you hope?
I love this question, Pam. So perhaps I'm a hopeful person, and I'm also a realist. I'm a visionary, which is kind of in that hope and dreamy, creative space. However, I'm also a realist. I ran a company. We had to look at numbers. And so I see society's challenges. I see the world of work's challenges. I see the future of businesses challenges, and pay attention. And with being honorable to that, I understand the complexities of what we're dealing with now. And I would have to tell you, Pam, that I have eternal hope, and I'm very excited about the future. That doesn't mean a future without peril. We've never had that. But a realistic hope is, I see this period of time, and of course, this is my opinion only, as kind of like the cocoonish phase of a butterfly, where the cocoon is starting to crack open, and it's kind of like this wiggle and struggle, and a lot of the old and more antiquated versions of what's not working anymore is either falling away, or it needs to fall away. One of the questions I asked my executives last month was, what do you need to drop, and what do you need to let die off? Because we're not very good at that as a society or leaders. We like to keep circling on the same thoughts day after day after day that have kept us looping. And so I see this as the cocoon phase of a lot of shedding and cracking open, and a new kind of, I don't know if you want to call it an awakening to like a newer and higher elevation and perspective. And I see that we're evolving. So we're kind of in that gap phase of like, a lot of what we knew even pre-COVID is no longer even available. And moving into this new personal and professional history, like a lot of our old history and habits are no longer at play. And we haven't realized or appreciated or even grieved all of the transitions that we've made in the last few years. And so our psychology almost needs to catch up. So I just think that the world is just cracking open with opportunity, and I think flourishing is sometimes the first mindset. Are we going to have a mindset of fear and when will I crash? When will our business crash? Versus what decision can I make differently? Like that 1% level up. And that perspective changes a lot, and more than people would give it credence to change.
And I love your question, what can we do to flourish, rather than when are things going to get back to normal, right? The pandemic yanked us out of what we considered normalcy, and we're never going to go back to what we considered normal prior to. But to your earlier points, there are plenty of us who are grieving parts of that loss, right? Because that's all we've ever known, what professional life was like pre-pandemic.
Yes. And I think it's important to pause and to grieve, and to really think about accepting the new life we have now. And I kind of attribute it back to when my first husband died when I was 30, which is, 20 some years ago. the life I thought I would have was
Mhm.
gone in
Mhm.
parts, not in total, but in parts. And so I had to create a new story. And I
Yep.
think that is an exciting call to action now, is what old stories need to die within our companies, within my leadership, within my own personal habits, so that I can elevate and shed some of that old coat type of stuff, so that we can really, I think it's the cure partially for a lot of the angst and fears and overwhelm that people are feeling now. Is we have anxiety because we fear so much.
Yes.
The pandemic sidelined a lot of us. And so if we can move beyond that into a more hopeful state, well, then what? That's exciting.
And your earlier comment as well about what is it that we should quit doing or get rid of or drop off? What can we shed? I read a quote by Steve Jobs this morning, and the quote said, "I'm just as proud of the things we decided not to do as the things we accomplished. Because if we hadn't decided not to do certain things, we wouldn't have had the resources to accomplish what we accomplished." So making those very deliberate, decisive decisions about where to focus also, I think, is hopeful.
Yes. Well, and being even more deliberate of, I mean, Steve Jobs was the perfect example of, you'd come up with 100 brainstorming
Mhm.
ideas within a strategic planning meeting of his executives, and he'd cross out every one of them except for the top, what, 2 to 5, I
Yep.
think, something like
Yep.
that.
Very
And
focused.
so really focus, where are we focusing? And so many of us are focusing on the ills that we are either real and true, or a lot of times that we're fabricating and making it a much bigger monster than it is. And again, not playing small to any world perils going on,
Right.
but really the ones that will elevate us out of this are the ones that are thinking futuristic and creative and hopeful, like that higher vibration energy.
Yes. Yes. I love that. Okay. My final question, and I love asking my podcast guests this question. If you are willing to come back and talk with me on another podcast in 1 year's time, what will have changed?
Yes. Well, as the hopeful person and the hopeful leader and the creative and visionary, number one, I would love to come back and talk in a year, Pam. I would hope that how I would answer these questions would be much different. And where I would say, I am now working with companies to implement the first level of platform for ESG. And then turning it over to my vetted professionals for deeper planning. And I would love to talk about how excited we are about how integrated ESG and all of the related principles are now just exploding within companies, and within not only companies, but just, human civilization.
Yes. Society at large.
Yes. And so I would hope that we're talking more in present tense of it's being done, it's widespread, it's not accepted, or it is accepted and not an anomaly anymore.
Right.
Just like the next big idea that somebody's trying to push on me. So that is my hope, and I actually think we will be well on that road.
I hope you're right. One of my colleagues that also practices in this space said, his whole mission is to make sure he doesn't have a job in a certain number of years, because this will just be the norm. Nobody will need an outside ESG consultant anymore. So let's hope we get there. That would be wonderful. And I do absolutely want to have you back a year from now, and we'll test our predictions.
Well, thank you, Pam.
Thank you so much for joining us.